Hello, I'm Mark Burbach with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it's a pleasure to be with you virtually to talk about some results of a research project that was funded by the United States Department of Agriculture, and with my colleagues Wes Eaton at Penn State, Christina Babbitt at the Environmental Defense Fund, Barbara Quimby at Arizona State, and Jody Delosier at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'd like to talk to you about some results from some research. As you can see, the title of this research was and is an assessment of local integrated water resource management in the Platte River Basin of Nebraska. The purpose, twofold, of this project was to assess water resource management in the fully and over-appropriated portions of the Nebraska Platte River Basin following Ostrom's principles of common pool resource management, and also would assess water resource management in the fully and over-appropriated portion of the Platte River Basin in Nebraska following stakeholder-identified criteria for successful water management in the Platte River Basin. And I can talk a little bit more about what these criteria are in a second, and Ostrom's principles. First, let's talk a little bit, give you a little bit of background of the regulatory framework in Nebraska regarding water quantity. It's bifurcated. There at the local level, groundwater is managed at the local level with natural resources districts. These natural resources districts are comprised of local elected boards with the general manager and staff to regulate groundwater. Groundwater, Nebraska follows correlative rights, meaning reasonable and beneficial use to the landowner. And surface water is regulated by the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources following the appropriative rights system, and this is first in time, first in right. Both systems have a preference system in which domestic is the top preference, followed by agriculture, manufacturing, and other. With regard to a brief history of groundwater law as it applies to this project, in 2004, the Nebraska legislature amended groundwater law in Nebraska, establishing a process for integrated water management when the Department of Natural Resources has designated a basin fully or over appropriated. The Department of Natural Resources conducts annual assessments of a stream flow and determining whether a basin is fully or over appropriated. If a basin is determined to be fully over appropriated, it requires, the state statute requires, integrated management plans in these fully or over appropriated basins. And if it's fully appropriated, it's required to maintain stream flows to 1997 levels. And if it's over appropriated, the statute requires that the NRD and DNR work together to return stream flows to 1997 levels. It requires integrated management plans every 10 years. The first integrated management plans in Nebraska were completed in 2009, and the second 10-year plans were completed in 2019. Integrated management plans are cooperative state and local arrangements. That is, the State Department of Natural Resources and the local natural resource districts in these fully appropriated areas recognize that hydrological connection between the surface water and groundwater. This decentralized process allows local NRDs to develop planning efforts and objectives on a local level while adhering to the requirements outlined in the state law. An important component of these integrated management plans are stakeholder engagement or input from stakeholders. If you consider the International Association of Public Participation, or IAP2, a spectrum of engagement, the integrated management planning process falls somewhere between consult and involve. Where you are in this spectrum, your perspective kind of depends on whether you're a state agency, an NRD, you may be leaning towards the involve area, and if you're a stakeholder, you may think that it's more on the consultative level of the spectrum. The Platte River begins in Colorado, both the North Platte and South Platte, and they join near North Platte, Nebraska, to become the Platte River, and it ultimately drains into the Missouri River on the eastern side of Nebraska. So the North Platte, South Platte, and then the Platte traverse the entire state west to east. There are 23 natural resources districts in Nebraska, and you see that there are several natural resources districts that the Platte River flows through: North Platte, Twin Platte, Central Platte Tri-Basin, and Lower Platte, South Platte, before it dumps in to the Missouri River. The area that this study was concerned with was the area of the Platte River that is fully or over appropriated. So you can see on this slide that the North Platte River Basin is determined to be over appropriated. The South Platte is also over appropriated, and then the Central Platte is both over appropriated and then becomes fully appropriated. So this is the area of our research. Then in this, as I mentioned, this assessment was conducted following Eleanor Ostrom's Principles of Common Pool Resource Management. Eleanor won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her body of work in studying how do successful local communities govern the commons. And these principles describe how communities devise ways to govern the commons to assure its survival for their needs and future generations. There are 8 principles, starting with clearly defined water use rules, local control, and also local ability to influence the rules. Benefits must outweigh cost, and there are adequate mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement of the rules, as well as mechanisms to resolve conflict, and the governance is integrated or there involves nested institutions. Also in 2000, published in 2015, but the research was conducted in 2011-2012. Babbitt and others interviewed 35 Platte Basin stakeholders, producers, and determined that there were 7 criteria that they consider to be necessary for successful management of groundwater in the Platte Basin. And these 7 are leadership, knowledge, flexibility, trust between agencies and the stakeholders, funding, adequate funding, equity, and also proactive planning. Some results that we build upon from the 2015 study from Babbitt and others is that regarding these 8 principles and 7 stakeholder identified criteria, found that using a Likert scale of 1 to 5, meaning that anything below 3, the participants or the survey participants, the stakeholders, considered they disagreed with that the criteria was being implemented or followed well, and anything above 3 meant that they generally agreed that the principle was being followed. So if you see on this table, the first principle, clearly defined water use rules, in the 2015 study, that again the data was collected 2 years after the first IMP, Integrated Management Plan process, was conducted. They generally agreed that there were clearly defined rules. However, the ability to influence rules was generally disagreed. Adequate conflict resolution, integration, and leadership was also slightly considered to be in disagreement by the participants, as well as trust and equity. So we followed up in 2019 after the second round of integrated management planning in Nebraska to see if anything had changed with regard to the perception of Ostrom's principles and the 7 leadership or criteria necessary for success in managing the over or fully appropriate basin. So we have the 2012 data, we have the 2019 data from Platte River Basin producers. We also have 2019 survey of Platte River non-farm residents, and also we also collected data in the 2019 survey of Nebraska-wide non-farm residents. This is part of the Nebraska Annual Social Indicators Survey. So we have 4 different surveys that we're looking to compare here. Here's a table of results of the one-way ANOVA comparing the Platte River basins in 2012 to the Platte Basin stakeholders in 2019. These are producers. And we see that clearly defined rules. There was general agreement that there were clearly defined rules being applied in this integrated management process. But if you look at the green blocks here, we find that local control from the perception of producers there's more agreement, or that they believe that more participants believe that there is local control, They also believe that there's an ability to influence the rules, and a significant increase. There was a significant increase in the perception that there are adequate mechanisms for conflict resolution, and that the system, the governance is integrated, or there are adequate nested institutions, that there's local and state involvement. You also notice where there some in the survey where there was some decrease in perception of how things are working. And with regard to the benefits outweighing costs, there was some, although it's generally still favorable or in agreement, that there was a decrease in benefits outweighing costs in participating in water development in Nebraska. I also find that trust has decreased since between the two integrated management planning processes in the 10 years. Funding, is there adequate funding? While yes, there still is slightly above the mean 3 of that they agree that there is adequate funding, but there have been a significant decrease in the number of participants who feel that way. And notably, there's a significant decrease in the feeling that the process is equitable. So if we add in the data from the Platte Basin non-farm and the Nebraska-wide non-farm, you see that there was a significant difference in perception of enforcement. And not surprisingly, the Platte producers, or more those actually being feeling the brunt of enforcement, feel that's more than adequate, and slightly or significantly less so from residents both in the basin and Nebraska-wide. So, in summary and discussion here, all 4 stakeholder groups agree that local control is integral to water management in the Platte Basin, and that application of this principle has improved in the intervening years from the perspective of Platte Basin stakeholders. Additionally, there also appears, however, to be a majority of Platte Basin stakeholders who now believe that there are adequate mechanisms in place to manage conflict, and that local and state water management activities are well integrated. In addition, there's a perceived reduction in trust in water management agencies and equitable treatment of water users, which should garner the attention of the natural resources districts and Department of Natural Resources going forward in planning for the next 10 year, the next 10 years when they do the next integrated management process. And in the intervening years, perhaps there's some things they can do to improve trust and the perception of equity in the management process. And finally, a majority of Platte Basin stakeholders do not yet agree that they have an ability to influence water use rules. That significant increase in this principle is encouraging. So I wish to thank you for participating. I look forward to answering or talking about this in our discussion. So very much thank you for watching and listening, and there are some references, and I look forward to again talking to you.